She spent years paying her stepdaughter's bills, the car, college, the apartment, the insurance. She did all of this without complaining, without asking for any recognition. That is, until the day her husband looked her right in the eye in front of the entire family and told her she had no right to correct her own stepdaughter. That was the moment Diane Miller opened her laptop and, in less than an hour, changed absolutely everything. But before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, what state or country are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories reach. Diane Miller was 55 years old and had learned, the hard way, that there is a massive difference between being a true part of a family and simply serving one. She lived in a charming, picturesque town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, where the grocery store always has the same cashier, and where gossip travels faster than the wind. She was a woman with a quiet presence, sporting brown hair with a few silver streaks she never bothered to hide, and hands that were always busy doing something. If you met her for the first time, you might not immediately notice the sharp intelligence in her eyes, or the silent way she observed everything around her before speaking. She possessed the kind of patience that people often mistake for passivity, but which is actually a deliberate choice, the choice of someone who has lived long enough to know that not every battle is worth her energy. Diane's first marriage had ended when she was 41, after nearly 2 decades living alongside a man who, over time, became a total stranger. It wasn't a scandalous divorce. It was quiet, almost exhausted, like a candle that goes out not because the wind blew too hard, but simply because it ran out of wax. She walked away from that relationship with a grown daughter named Chloe, a small house in her name, and the deep conviction that if she ever married again, it would be different. Not perfect, she had abandoned the illusion of perfection years ago, but different. More honest. More reciprocal. It took her a few years to find that. Or, at least, what she thought was that. She met Richard Brooks on an October afternoon, in one of those mundane situations that seem highly improbable when you recount them later. He was a structural engineer with an easy smile and a calm voice that settled her nerves in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't a perfect man, and she knew that from the start. He had a tendency to avoid conflict, masking it as diplomacy, when in reality, it was just his way of never taking a real stance. Even so, he seemed attentive. He seemed present. He seemed like the kind of man who builds a life with the person next to him, not just around them. He also had an 18-year-old daughter named Ashley from his first marriage. Ashley lived with her mother most of the time but would pop in on weekends and during the holidays. Ashley was blonde, pretty, and carried that specific energy of someone who is used to being the center of attention without ever having to ask for it. Diane wasn't scared off by this. On the contrary, she saw it as part of the package, something you accept when you truly love someone. She was a mother herself, she knew what it meant to love a daughter. Diane imagined, with the generous naivety of someone who still believes in the best of people, that Ashley would accept her over time. That they would build something, maybe not a close friendship, but at least a mutual respect, a solid ground where they could walk without stepping on each other's toes. The wedding took place 18 months later. It was a simple ceremony, just close family and a few friends. Ashley was there, wearing a blue dress, watching everything with an expression that Diane interpreted as shyness. Looking back today, she recognizes it wasn't shyness at all. It was evaluation. The girl was calculating everything, the spaces, the people, and especially Diane, figuring out exactly how much she could get away with and how much she could demand. The first few months were decent enough. Richard was a present husband, at least at the beginning. He sat down for meals, talked about his day at work, and helped with the household expenses. Ashley came over on weekends, and Diane did everything she could to create a welcoming environment. She cooked Ashley's favorite meals, kept the guest room spotless, and asked about her college classes with genuine interest. There was a distance, sure, but Diane treated it as something natural, something time would eventually fix. Time did not fix it. It did the exact opposite. Ashley started coming around more. First, weekends turned into full weeks. Then came the expenses that started creeping into the joint bank account in ways that no one ever openly discussed. Ashley's car insurance, suddenly on autopay. Her out-of-state college tuition, delayed by a month, then 2, and finally paid by Diane without anyone explicitly asking her to, just driven by the silent expectation that it was the right thing to do. Small amounts started adding up. Then, the big amounts started appearing. Diane paid. Not because anyone ordered her to, but because the atmosphere in the house made not paying feel unthinkable. Richard hated talking about money. Whenever the topic came up, he brushed it off with a smile or promised that things would sort themselves out. And Diane, who had spent years learning not to make unnecessary noise in a marriage, was once again learning to swallow her doubts and just keep pushing forward. She worked as an administrative coordinator at a medical clinic. The salary was good, not extraordinary, but enough for a comfortable life. Richard's salary was higher, at least on paper. In practice, however, she was the one orchestrating the bills, the one who knew exactly what came in and what went out, the one keeping the house running like a clock that nobody notices until it stops ticking. The incident that shattered everything happened on a Sunday night in November, right before the Thanksgiving long weekend. Diane's sister, Susan, had come over for dinner with her husband. Her nephew, Tyler, who lived a couple of towns over, was also there. It was one of those casual family get-togethers that Diane loved to host. The table was set, the food was great, the smell of Sunday pot roast filled the house, and there was that warm feeling that things were exactly where they were supposed to be, that life had finally found a good rhythm. Ashley arrived late, as usual. She walked through the front door with the commanding energy of someone who owns the room before even crossing it, tossed her bag on the sofa, and walked straight into the kitchen, yanking the fridge open without properly greeting anyone. Diane was used to this behavior. She had trained herself not to react, to let it slide, to write it off as immaturity rather than a deliberate lack of respect. It was a convenient excuse that had kept her at peace for a long time. Dinner started off well. The conversation flowed, wine and craft beer were passed around, and Susan told a funny story about her office. There was laughter. There was that comforting noise of people who love each other gathered around a table. Diane looked at the scene for a moment and thought that maybe she had been overreacting about Ashley. That maybe things were actually on the right track. That was when Ashley, right in the middle of a lull in the conversation, looked at the table and said, in a casual tone that made the comment cut even deeper, that the house was certainly kept very organized for a housekeeper. She said it with a slight smirk, like someone making an innocent observation, as if the words carried no weight at all. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but for Diane, it felt like an eternity. She was standing by the kitchen island, holding a dish towel. She felt the comment pierce something deep inside her, not like a sudden stab, but like that specific, sickening pressure you feel when you realize the ground is slowly giving way beneath your feet. Calmly, without raising her voice, she told Ashley that this was her home and she expected to be treated with respect inside of it. Ashley rolled her eyes with the breezy dismissal of someone who doesn't think the topic deserves another second of her time. And then Richard, who had listened to everything in silence from the head of the table, leaned forward slightly. He looked directly at Diane and said, in a voice that sounded almost bored, as if he were explaining something obvious to someone a bit too slow to grasp it, that Ashley was not her daughter, and she had absolutely no right to correct her. Susan stopped breathing for a second. Tyler dropped his gaze to his plate. Ashley went back to scrolling on her iPhone as if the matter was permanently closed. And Diane, still gripping the dish towel, just nodded her head once. Okay, she said. Just that. It was the most dangerous nod of her entire life. Not because it meant submission, but because it meant she had finally understood everything she ever needed to understand in that exact moment. That night, after everyone left, Diane washed the dishes alone. Richard stayed in the living room watching ESPN. He didn't come into the kitchen, he didn't ask how she was, he didn't say a single word about what had happened at the dinner table. And she, for her part, didn't call him out. There was something different about the silence, a texture she vaguely recognized but which, this time, felt deeply final. It felt like realizing a fracture you thought was minor had actually snapped the bone clean in two. She dried every plate slowly, stacked them in the cabinets, and wiped down the sink. The ritual of cleaning had always soothed her. There was something concrete and honest about scrubbing away the dirt, about putting everything in its proper place. That night, however, the chore left a different taste in her mouth. She was cleaning the kitchen of a house that, just hours ago, someone had declared wasn't hers. She went upstairs without waking Richard. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't cry. That actually surprised her. The first time her marriage had collapsed, she cried for days, sitting on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m, trying to figure out how she got there. This time, there was a cold clarity that felt almost alien. It was as if some gear inside her had finally slipped into the wrong slot for the last time, and the entire machine just ground to a halt. Not dramatically. It just stopped. She thought about Ashley, about the tone of that comment, about those specific words, housekeeper, delivered with the ease of someone who doesn't believe they're saying anything wrong. Then she thought about Richard. Not the Richard from dinner, but the Richard of the last several months. The way he had gradually, and without ever announcing it, built a dynamic where Diane's hard work was expected, and Ashley's needs were treated as emergencies. Where Diane's effort was just the background scenery, and his daughter's drama was the main plot. There was a pattern there that she had actively chosen not to see before. Now it was glaringly visible, and she couldn't unsee it. Early the next morning, before the sun even fully rose, she walked downstairs, brewed a pot of coffee, and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The house was dead silent. Outside the windows, the light was still that dark, pre-dawn blue. She loved this time of day. It had always belonged solely to her. What happened over the next few hours was simultaneously simple and entirely devastating. Throughout their marriage, Diane had been the one managing the household finances. Not because of some formal agreement between the two of them, but because of that silent, insidious way responsibilities pile up on whoever is willing to carry them. The person who is organized, who is reliable, who doesn't complain ends up, almost inevitably, carrying far more than they should. She knew every password, every automatic charge, every recurring payment. She knew exactly every dollar that came in and went out. She started with the bank. She pulled up the joint account and audited every transaction from the last 12 months. Some she recognized instantly. Others required her to click, open the receipt, and verify the merchant. It took her less than an hour to piece together the entire map, and when she was done, she stared at the screen with the sinking feeling of someone who has just opened a box they should have opened a long time ago. Ashley's SUV, a compact crossover Richard had helped her pick out, cost $550 a month in financing, pulled directly from the joint account that Diane funded with a huge chunk of her own paycheck. The car insurance was another $200. The gap between Ashley's financial aid and the tuition at her private liberal arts college varied, but always hovered around $800 to $900 a month. Sorority dues. The unlimited iPhone plan that had been in Diane's name ever since the day Ashley forgot to pay hers, and Richard asked Diane to add her to the family plan, just for now. A boutique gym membership that Diane had never once agreed to. And then, hidden among the more obvious transactions, were the direct transfers. Round numbers, $100 here, $250 there, tagged with descriptions like emergency or textbooks. Transfers made by Richard straight to Ashley's checking account, without ever mentioning it, without discussing it, just done. Done with the ease of someone who assumes nobody will notice, or if they do, they won't dare question it. Diane compiled everything into a new spreadsheet. It took her 40 minutes to log every single line item with its exact date and dollar amount. When she finished, she stared at the final number for a long time, unhurried, letting the sheer weight of that total crush down on her. It wasn't just the money that paralyzed her. It was what the money represented. Over a year of silent, financial bleeding to support a life that, the night before, had been dismissed as the work of a housekeeper. Over a year of waking up early, organizing, making sure bills were paid on time, and providing a stable foundation for a girl who treated her like trash, and a man who only defended her when it served his interests. She heard footsteps upstairs. Richard was waking up. She didn't rush. Calmly, she logged into the auto loan portal. She located the payment method and deleted it. Next, she opened the insurance website and canceled the autopay link to her account. She left the policy active, because she wasn't reckless, but she made it very clear that paying the premium was no longer her problem. She did the exact same thing with the cell phone plan. With the college tuition portal. With the luxury gym membership they had never even discussed. Every click was a short, definitive, and perfectly polite execution. Ashley's phone buzzed somewhere in the house before Richard even made it down the stairs. And Diane just sat there, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the day to truly begin. Richard came downstairs looking like a man still processing the day before. Hair messy, holding an empty mug, carrying that morning posture Diane had learned to read over the years, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes taking a minute to fully focus. It's the kind of intimate detail you learn about someone when you live with them, their rhythm, their movements, the way they occupy space before they are fully awake. She had learned all of that about Richard. And today, she realized that knowledge had benefited him far more than it had ever benefited her. He saw her sitting at the table with her laptop open and froze for a second. Something about the scene made him hesitate. She was far too quiet, far too composed, lacking the usual hustle of someone making breakfast or organizing the day. He felt that something had shifted before he even knew what it was. The conversation that followed was not a screaming match. That was crucial. Diane had decided, at some point during her sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, that she was not going to yell. Not because she didn't have the anger, she had plenty of it, but because yelling would make things too easy for Richard. It would allow him to reduce everything to an emotional outburst, to the instability of an overreacting woman upset by her stepdaughter's comment. She was not going to give him that escape hatch. So, she spoke with the same clear, calm authority she used to run difficult meetings at the medical clinic, presenting the facts, asking direct questions, and never raising her voice when the other party tried to deflect. And Richard tried to deflect several times. He claimed Ashley's comment was just an out-of-line observation, nothing more. That Ashley was still adjusting. That he himself felt uncomfortable with what she said, but it just wasn't the right time to reprimand his daughter. Every sentence was a spin, a desperate attempt to shrink what had happened. And with every attempt, Diane dragged him right back to what actually occurred, not Ashley's comment in isolation, but his response to it. The deliberate choice he made to side with his daughter over his wife, using words that stripped Diane of any authority inside her own home. "You said I had no right to correct her," she told him. Not that her comment was inappropriate, not that we'd talk about it later. You said I had no right. He sighed. He ran a hand through his hair. He claimed he said it in the heat of the moment. She asked him if the heat of the moment had lasted for an entire year. Because that was how long she had been treated this way, and for that entire year, he had stayed completely silent. He didn't have an answer for that. His cell phone rang. It was Ashley. He asked for a second and stepped into the hallway, and Diane sat there listening to snippets of the conversation, Richard's low, controlled voice, the voice he used when trying to manage a crisis without letting anyone know there was a crisis. When he came back, there was a specific exhaustion on his face that she recognized perfectly. It was the exhaustion of a man trying to keep two completely different lies spinning at the same time, finally realizing the effort is unsustainable. He said Ashley was hysterical. The insurance auto draft had bounced, the credit card was declining, and she didn't understand what was going on. Diane told him that she understood perfectly what was going on. Richard asked if she could, just for now, reinstate the payments until they had time to sit down and talk calmly. That, just for now, spoke volumes about how he viewed the situation, as a temporary tantrum, a massive overreaction that, with enough patience, he could convince Diane to undo. She told him no. She picked up her laptop, grabbed the manila folder of documents she had prepped, and walked upstairs. She had work to do. And it wasn't the kind of work he was expecting. It was while searching for an old payment confirmation, 3 days after that disastrous dinner, that Diane found the email. She was combing through Richard's inbox, which she had access to because he had asked her to track down some financial receipts for tax season months ago, when she stumbled across an email thread he had started with Ashley about 7 months prior. The subject line was about a looming tuition deadline. She almost scrolled past it. She clicked it more out of instinct than intention. Richard's message to Ashley was blunt and casual, written the way people type when their guard is completely down. He told his daughter not to stress about the tuition payment. He wrote that Diane took care of those things because she likes to feel needed. That paying for things was her way of buying her place in the family. Diane read it twice. Then a third time. She closed the laptop. She sat at her desk for several minutes with her hands resting on the wood, staring out the window. Outside, the oak trees in the yard were almost completely bare. It was a cold, gray afternoon, the kind that arrives like a threat of a long, brutal winter. A small bird was perched on the nearest branch, completely motionless, as if it were also processing something heavy. She had spent a year believing she was building something. Believing that her presence, her financial contributions, her endless effort were the bricks of a foundation they were all building together, even if everyone was working at different speeds. She believed there was reciprocity, flawed and slow, sure, but real. She believed Richard viewed her as an equal partner. The email proved otherwise. It proved Richard viewed her as a convenient ATM. He had framed Diane's financial support to his daughter not as the generous act of a woman who loved their family, but as the pathetic psychological need of an insecure woman trying to buy affection. He had weaponized her generosity into a weakness. He used Diane's image as a shield to guarantee that Ashley would never feel an ounce of obligation, no gratitude, no respect, not even basic human decency. Because, in their narrative, Diane wasn't doing them a favor. She was just feeding her own desperate ego. That was the story Richard had sold. Diane sat there for a long, long time. She didn't cry. She had cried in the Target parking lot days earlier, that silent, involuntary weeping that hits you before you can even hit the brakes. This time, there were no tears. There was only that razor-sharp clarity that strikes when the final puzzle piece snaps into place, and you finally see the whole ugly picture. She called Susan that afternoon. Susan listened to the whole story without interrupting once. Her sister had that rare talent of actually listening, instead of formulating her own reply while the other person was still talking. When Diane finished, there was a heavy pause. Then Susan said, with her trademark bluntness, that this wasn't just a slip-up. It was calculated manipulation. She told Diane that men like that rarely change after emotional conversations, because they just dismiss emotion as female instability. They only change when faced with concrete consequences, things they can't spin or reinterpret. And it was time to stop having conversations and start documenting consequences. Diane hung up the phone and opened a fresh Word document. She began logging everything with the exact same clinical methodology she used at the medical clinic. Precise dates, exact dollar amounts, linked bank statements. Every single payment pulled from her account. Every stealth transfer Richard made to Ashley. The email, saved as a PDF and printed in triplicate. She even typed up every instance of Ashley's disrespect that she had previously kept a mental tally of, but had never written down because they always felt too petty to formalize. On paper, none of it looked petty. It took her 2 days to compile the master file. When she was done, she held an organized, chronological, ironclad dossier of exactly what had transpired over the last year. It wasn't an angry manifesto. It was an objective record of reality. First, to validate herself. Second, to protect herself in court, if it came to that. Richard tried to talk to her a few times over those 2 days. She didn't avoid him, but she didn't get dragged into the weeds either. She responded with icy objectivity. When he tried to minimize the damage, she pointed back to the facts. When he tried to blame Ashley's youth and immaturity as a blanket excuse, she brought up the email. No theatrical rage, no tears, just the quiet, unshakable firmness of a woman who had finally stopped asking for permission to trust her own eyes. One night, Richard asked her if she had thought about what she was doing to their marriage. She looked at him and replied that she had been thinking entirely about what this marriage had done to her. He didn't have a response for that. And his silence was, once again, the most honest thing he had given her in months. Meeting at the coffee shop was Richard's idea. He pitched it as neutral territory, a place to talk without the walls of their house echoing all the baggage of the last few days. He picked a Starbucks clone downtown, dark wood tables, low indie music, busy enough to give the illusion of normalcy, but quiet enough to actually hear each other. Diane read his playbook perfectly. Public enough to ensure she wouldn't make a scene. Neutral enough for him to control the narrative. She agreed to go. Not because she expected an apology, but because a part of her needed Ashley to be there. She needed this conversation to happen in the light of day, not in the shadows of a marriage where the story could be twisted and rewritten later. She needed a third witness to the truth. Diane arrived early. She ordered a black coffee, set her manila folder on the table, and watched the street through the window. A couple of women walking a golden retriever, a kid running ahead of his parents, cars rolling by on a slow Saturday morning. The world was completely oblivious to the implosion about to happen at that corner table. Richard and Ashley walked in together. Ashley looked different today. Her makeup was still flawless, her hair perfect, but there was a stiffness to her posture Diane had never seen before. A nervous hyper-awareness. Her eyes scanned the room before locking onto Diane, looking exactly like someone who just lost a major piece on the chessboard and is frantically trying to calculate the fallout. They sat down. They ordered drinks. The barista dropped them off and vanished with the quick efficiency of someone who knows when to make themselves scarce. Richard opened by saying this didn't need to be a huge disaster. That they were all adults. That they could handle this civilized. Diane calmly replied that acting civilized was exactly what she was doing. Ashley stayed completely silent for the first few minutes, just observing. Finally, she asked, in a voice completely stripped of the nasty edge she'd had at dinner, why Diane had cut everything off so violently, without warning, without giving anyone a chance to talk. Diane stared directly into her eyes before answering. She told Ashley that she did give a warning. At dinner, when she explicitly asked for respect inside her own home. She reminded Ashley that the request was ignored, not just by her, but by her own father, who used that exact moment to publicly announce that Diane had zero authority to correct anyone. Then, she opened the manila folder and slid the first page across the table. Richard looked down. Ashley leaned in. The spreadsheet listed, in flawless chronological order, every single payment, every amount, every account. The SUV, the Geico insurance, the out-of-state tuition, the sorority fees, the random direct deposits. Everything dated, everything backed by bank records. It was a sterile, emotionless document. No adjectives. Just math. The silence that blanketed the table felt entirely different from all the previous silences. It was the suffocating silence of looking at hard evidence that you cannot argue with, only endure. Ashley glanced at her dad. He kept his eyes glued to the table, refusing to look up. That's when Diane pulled out the second sheet of paper and placed it perfectly between them. It was the printed email. Diane didn't say a word while they read it. She didn't have to. Richard's exact words to his daughter were right there, time-stamped, dripping with the casual arrogance of a man typing something he assumed would never see the light of day. She pays because she likes to feel needed. It's her way of buying her place. Ashley read it slowly. Then she read it again. Her face shifted into something entirely new. It wasn't the arrogant smirk from dinner, nor the defensive anxiety of the last few days. It was confusion. The deep, gut-wrenching confusion that hits you when a reality you fully believed in starts springing leaks, and you realize the story you were told was a complete lie. She looked at her father. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He stammered that it was just a way to simplify things, that he was just trying to keep her from stressing out and maybe used the wrong words. Diane cut in, saying his words were actually incredibly effective. They were effective enough to guarantee Ashley spent an entire year bleeding Diane dry without feeling a single ounce of guilt or obligation. The lie functioned exactly as it was designed to. Ashley whispered, almost to herself, that she had no idea Diane was paying for all of it. She thought her dad was covering the lion's share. Diane looked right at her and said, "I believe you." And she meant it. She told Ashley that was exactly the core of the rot. The way Richard orchestrated the lie guaranteed Ashley would never have a chance to live in reality. He bought his daughter's comfort using Diane's paycheck, and he did it in a way that ensured Ashley would never even know she owed anyone a thank you. The barista swung by with terrible timing, asking if they needed anything else. Richard quickly said no. Diane asked to close out her tab, paid for her black coffee, left a tip, and carefully slipped her folder back into her tote bag. Before standing up, she looked at both of them and said, without an ounce of cruelty but with absolute conviction, that she hadn't come here to punish anyone. She came here to set the record straight between the three people who actually knew what happened, so that no matter what lies were spun later, the absolute truth had been spoken out loud, to their faces, at least once. Then she stood up and walked out the door. The air outside was crisp and biting. She took one long, deep breath and felt an unfamiliar sensation wash over her. It took her a second to identify it. It wasn't quite relief. It was the distinct physical lightness of someone who had been carrying a boulder on their back for years, and had finally dropped it on the pavement. The weeks that followed were shockingly pragmatic, in a way Diane hadn't anticipated. She expected internal chaos. She expected to second-guess herself, to mourn, to lie awake analyzing every choice to make sure she wasn't making a terrible mistake. Instead, she slipped into a hyper-focused administrative mode. It felt like finally cleaning out a junk drawer you've ignored for years. Once it's spotless, you can't fathom how you ever lived with the mess. She hired a sharp, ruthless divorce attorney down in Manhattan, recommended by a doctor at her clinic. She walked into the first consultation and handed over her master file. The lawyer reviewed the spreadsheets, the bank statements, and the email, and told her she had executed a flawless documentation job. She was in a prime position for a fast, clean, and highly favorable settlement. That was the ultimate, bitter irony of her marriage. The exact same meticulous organization that Richard had exploited to drain her dry was now the weapon that guaranteed she would walk away fully protected. She severed the bank accounts the following week. What was hers returned to her sole control. The joint assets were catalogued for an aggressive, 50-50 split. Richard didn't fight her on it. Maybe he knew that fighting a paper trail that solid was financial suicide, or maybe, somewhere deep down in a layer of honesty he rarely visited, he knew he had pushed her way too far. Ashley called her on a Thursday evening. Diane picked up with the calm curiosity of someone who truly didn't know what to expect. The conversation was awkward. Not hostile, but loaded with the heavy, static tension of two people trying to find words for a disaster neither knew how to navigate. Ashley started by reiterating that she truly didn't know the scale of the money. She believed the story her dad fed her. Diane told her she believed her, and it was the truth. A 20-year-old college kid who had been repeatedly told by her father that her stepmom paid for things out of a pathetic psychological need didn't stand a chance of figuring out the truth on her own. Ashley told her that the comment at the dinner table was vile, and that she was genuinely sorry. Diane let the silence hang for a moment, letting the apology land. She told Ashley she accepted the apology. She told her the comment was cruel, but the real blame belonged to Richard. He was the architect who built a twisted narrative around Diane, a narrative that made that level of disrespect not just possible, but logical. When you are manipulated into believing someone is giving you things just to feed their own ego, it's natural to feel zero gratitude. It's natural to even feel a little contempt. In her own way, Ashley had been played just as badly as Diane. Ashley didn't say much after that, but she didn't hang up right away, either. They sat on the line in a thick, heavy silence. Not an empty silence, but one packed with a million things that might never actually be spoken out loud, but finally existed in the space between them. When the call ended, Diane sat with her phone in her hand for a long time. Something in her chest felt different, a small crack of light where a brick wall used to be. It wasn't a friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a flicker of shared humanity. The mutual recognition that they had both been pawns in a game neither of them had agreed to play. The divorce finalized without any explosive courtroom drama. Diane signed a lease on a new apartment in early December. It was smaller than the house, but it had a beautiful east-facing balcony that flooded the living room with morning sun. She had toured it on a freezing afternoon, with the local shops already stringing up their Christmas lights. She had stood on that empty balcony, watching the strangers walk by on the sidewalk below, and felt a profound sense of freedom she hadn't felt in decades. She signed the paperwork that same week. Tyler called her one night, no real reason, just checking in. She told him she was doing great, and for the first time in years, she wasn't lying. He told her he had been haunted by that Sunday dinner, by the suffocating silence after Richard spoke, and by the way she just nodded and went back to the dishes. He said her quiet reaction terrified him more than if she had thrown a plate at the wall. She smiled softly and told him that sometimes, total silence is the loudest alarm bell of all. On her first morning in the new apartment, Diane woke up at 6 a.m. and just lay in bed, listening. There was no ESPN blaring downstairs. No heavy footsteps on the floorboards. There was none of the baseline, buzzing tension she had learned to ignore, that constant, low-level anxiety of always needing to calibrate someone else's mood before the day even started. There was only the muffled sound of morning traffic, the wind rattling the balcony glass, and the quiet of the apartment itself. This silence had a totally different texture than the silence in Richard's house. That was the silence of a gag order. This was the silence of total peace. She got up, brewed a dark roast coffee, and stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping her hands around the hot mug. The sun was just breaking over the rooftops. That sharp, golden winter light that hits the concrete at an angle and makes everything look cinematic. She stood there for a long time, totally unhurried. No mental checklist of tuition bills. No emotional minefields to navigate. Just coffee, freezing air, and the sun hitting her face. It was an entirely ordinary morning. And it belonged 100% to her. In the months leading up to the move, she had naturally questioned if she overreacted. The human brain always wants to look in the rearview mirror, to check the crossroads and wonder if there was another route that didn't end in burning the bridge down. Did one nasty comment at Sunday dinner really justify blowing up her life? And the answer that always came back to her, steady as a heartbeat, was that the comment was never the core problem. The problem was the entire ecosystem that made the comment possible. A year of financial generosity weaponized into forced obligations. A husband who rewrote her love as pathetic desperation just to shield his daughter from ever having to say, thank you. An entire life built brick by brick where Diane's labor was the invisible foundation, and Ashley's entitlement was the penthouse suite. The comment was just the match that lit up the dark room so she could finally see the walls. And once you see the walls, you can't pretend you're free. Her sister Susan came over for dinner that weekend. She brought a bottle of Cabernet and a box of pastries from the bakery down the street. Susan kicked her shoes off, pulled her legs up on Diane's new sofa just like they used to do as teenagers, and looked around the apartment with a quiet nod of approval that meant more than 1,000 compliments. They talked late into the night, bouncing between heavy life advice and hysterical laughter over inside jokes only sisters understand. There was a lightness to the room that night that Diane hadn't felt in forever, the specific, intoxicating freedom of being in a space where you don't have to calculate a single word. When Susan finally headed home, Diane stood in the center of her kitchen. The wine glasses were washed. The apartment was quiet. She looked around at the things she had brought into the space. The books on the floating shelves, the thick woven blanket thrown over the chair, the winter-hardy plants she was slowly learning how to keep alive on the balcony. Every single item was there because she chose it. Not to appease a dynamic, not to keep the peace, not because it was expected of her. Simply because she liked it. It sounds so basic. And maybe it is. But for a woman who had spent 2 straight years running every single decision through a filter to appease other people, it felt like discovering fire. At 55 years old, Diane Miller had learned a few brutal lessons she wished she hadn't. She learned that paying the bills does not buy you a seat at the family table. She learned that when your patience isn't respected or reciprocated, it just becomes a green light for people to use you even harder. She learned that twisting yourself into knots to keep the peace doesn't make you a loving wife, it just makes you an exhausted one. And a woman's sheer exhaustion is not proof of her dedication. It's proof that the game was rigged against her from the start. She also learned the bitterest pill of all: she had allowed it to happen. Not because she was weak or stupid, but because she desperately wanted to believe that if she just poured enough of herself into the foundation, eventually they would treat her like she belonged in the house. And that desperate hope was the crack in the door they used to rob her blind. But her eyes were open now. And keeping them open was the only way to make sure it never happened again. The sun kept rising over that east-facing balcony every single day. Her paycheck stayed in her own bank account, funding her own life. She still went to work at the clinic, but her mornings before she clocked in had a completely different energy. There was no dread. No anticipating the next crisis. No fighting to balance the scales of a relationship that was designed to be permanently unbalanced. Just coffee, morning light, and taking the day at exactly her own pace. Sometimes, her mind drifted to Richard. Not with anger, the anger was packed away in a box she had no desire to open anymore. She thought of him with the clinical, detached curiosity you feel when watching a documentary about a stranger. She marveled at how easily he had reduced her love to a psychological defect, how effortlessly he typed that email to his daughter without a second thought. And she marveled at how long it took her to finally stop accepting a version of herself that was completely fabricated. But that time was over now. Diane Miller, 55 years old, living in upstate New York, had a balcony facing the sunrise, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, a morning that belonged to nobody but her, and the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who finally realized that basic dignity isn't something you negotiate for. It's something you demand, or you walk away. She was moving forward. The only way that actually mattered, on her own terms. If you loved this story, hit that subscribe button, and tell me in the comments, which part made your jaw drop. Oh, and don't forget to join as a channel member for access to exclusive videos I don't post anywhere else. See you in the next one.